The river was wild, its powerful waves crashing against the rocks. But in the middle of it all, something shocking was happening. A huge brown bear was struggling for its life. The poor animal thrashed in the freezing water, trying to stay afloat, but the strong current kept pulling it under. It gasped for air, its heavy soaked fur dragging it down. The mighty beast, feared by many, was now completely helpless. What would you do if you saw this happening right in front of you? Most people would panic, unsure of what to do. After all, this wasn't just any animal, it was a massive bear, a wild predator. But in that moment, it wasn't dangerous. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't attacking. It was simply trying to survive. And then, something incredible happened. A man named John Matthews, a wildlife rescuer, happened to be nearby. As soon as he saw the drowning bear, his heart started racing. He knew that if no one helped, the bear would not make it. But saving a wild bear wasn't like rescuing a dog or a cat. One wrong move, and he could end up in the same danger. Yet, despite the risks, John didn't think twice. He rushed to the riverbank, quickly assessing the situation. He had two choices: wait for backup and risk losing precious time, or take the biggest risk of his life and attempt to rescue himself. The icy wind howled, the bear let out a desperate grunt, and its body started slipping further into the raging water. Time was running out. John took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and made a life-changing decision, one that could either save the bear or cost him everything. What happened next would leave the world in shock. John Matthews had always been drawn to the wild. He wasn't just an animal lover, he was a trained wildlife rescuer who had spent years saving injured and trapped animals. From rescuing eagles tangled in power lines to freeing deer stuck in fences, he had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face that day. It was a cold, windy afternoon. The sky was dark, and a storm was brewing in the distance. The air smelled of rain, and strong gusts of wind rustled through the trees. John was driving home after a long and exhausting day when his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID. It was a park ranger. John answered, but before he could even say hello, the panicked voice on the other end spoke. "John, we've got a serious situation. A bear has fallen into the river. It's drowning." John's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His heart pounded. He knew this river well. It was notorious for its deadly currents, especially after heavy rains. Every year, unsuspecting hikers and even experienced swimmers were caught in its pool, and few ever made it out alive. If a bear, a creature built for the wild, was struggling in those waters, it meant only one thing: it was losing the battle. Without hesitation, John turned his truck around and floored the gas pedal. The ranger had given him the location, and he knew there wasn't much time. Rain started to drizzle, and the road was slick, but John couldn't slow down. He didn't know how long the bear had been in the water, but he knew every second counted. When he finally arrived at the scene, the sight made his stomach drop. There it was, a massive brown bear, at least 600 pounds, being tossed around like a rag doll in the raging river. The powerful waves slammed against its body, dragging it farther downstream. It was gasping for air, its heavy soaked fur pulling it under again and again. The poor animal tried to fight back, paddling with its massive paws, but the current was too strong. Every attempt to swim only made things worse. John could tell the bear hadn't fallen in by accident. Most likely, it had been searching for food along the riverbank and lost its footing. Maybe the soft, wet soil gave way beneath its weight. Maybe it tried to catch a fish and leaned too far over the edge. Whatever the reason, it was now trapped in a fight for its life. The park rangers were already there, standing at a safe distance, watching helplessly. They had called for backup, but John knew it wouldn't arrive in time. The only thing between the bear and certain death was the next few minutes. John quickly scanned the area. The river was surrounded by steep cliffs and jagged rocks, making any normal rescue almost impossible. There was no shallow area where the bear could crawl out. No fallen tree to act as a bridge. The only way to save it was to somehow get close enough to pull it out. But how? The freezing wind cut through John's jacket as he stepped closer to the edge, his boots sinking slightly into the wet mud. His mind raced. If he jumped in, the powerful current could take him too. If he used a rope, how would he get it around the bear? And even if he managed to reach it, would the bear panic and pull him under with it? He turned to the rangers. "Do you have any equipment? Ropes? Nets? Anything?" One of them shook his head. "Nothing strong enough for a bear this size. Even if we get a rope around it, pulling it out won't be easy." John clenched his jaw. This wasn't a simple rescue. This was a life-or-death mission, not just for the bear, but for anyone who tried to save it. He looked back at the river. The bear was getting weaker. Its movements were slowing down. It was no longer fighting as hard as before. It was giving up. John knew what that meant. He had minutes, maybe less, before the river claimed another victim. The logical choice would be to wait for more help. But John knew that wasn't an option. If they waited, the bear would be gone. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He had been in risky situations before, but nothing like this. He could stay on the riverbank, watching helplessly, or he could take the biggest risk of his life. John made his decision. There was no turning back now. The bear was thrashing helplessly, its massive body growing weaker with every passing second. It gasped for air, its head barely breaking the surface before the raging current dragged it back under. Its heavy fur, now drenched, pulled it down like an anchor, and the once mighty creature that ruled the forests was now completely at the mercy of the wild river. The powerful waves slammed against its body, twisting and tossing it as if it weighed nothing. John watched from the riverbank, his heart pounding. He had rescued animals before, but this was different. This wasn't a simple case of pulling a stranded deer from a fence or helping an injured bird. This was life and death. The bear let out a deep, desperate sound, a mix of exhaustion and fear. It wasn't just fighting against the water anymore, it was fighting against its own failing strength. The river was wild, swollen from days of heavy rain, turning its once calm waters into a violent, churning force of nature. It roared like a monster, swallowing everything in its path. The waves crashed against jagged rocks, and the strong current kept pulling the bear further and further away. If it drifted beyond this point, there would be no saving it. John clenched his fists, his breath shallow. Should he risk his life to save it? Every survival instinct in his body told him to wait, to be cautious, to think things through. But there was no time. The bear's movements were slowing. It was slipping under for longer each time. It was drowning. The park rangers stood nearby, frozen, their faces pale. One of them grabbed his radio, calling for more backup, but John knew the truth by the time help arrived. It would be too late. His mind raced, searching for options. He had no rope strong enough to pull a full-grown bear. No equipment to keep himself safe in those dangerous waters. No guarantees that if he jumped in, he'd even make it back out alive. Was it even possible to save this bear? But then, he looked into the bear's eyes wide, panicked, pleading. And in that moment, John knew he couldn't just stand there. He couldn't just watch. The freezing wind whipped through his clothes as he took a step closer to the water's edge. His boots sank slightly into the mud, but he didn't stop. If he hesitated now, the bear would die. John quickly pulled off his jacket, throwing it aside. Every muscle in his body tensed. He needed a plan. If he just jumped in blindly, the current could sweep him away before he even reached the bear. He had to be smart. He had to be fast. He scanned the river, looking for a break in the current, an area where the water was slightly calmer, where he could have a chance at reaching the bear without getting crushed against the rocks. Then he saw it, a fallen tree branch, partially submerged in the water, stretching out like a desperate hand reaching for help. It wasn't much, but it was something. Without wasting another second, John sprinted towards it. His feet slipped on the wet ground, but he kept moving. The branch was sturdy, thick enough to hold some weight. If he could use it as support, he might just get close enough. The bear was now barely moving, its head dipping below the surface for longer each time. It was exhausted. It was almost over. John grabbed a tree branch, bracing himself against the slippery rocks. The water was ice cold as it splashed against his skin, sending a shock through his body. He pushed forward, inching closer, gripping the branch as tightly as he could. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. "Come on, hold on just a little longer," he muttered under his breath, as if the bear could hear him. Finally, he was close enough. The bear was just a few feet away, its massive paws weakly paddling against the current. John reached out, his fingers just inches from the animal's fur. One chance. One moment. That's all he had. Then, in one final desperate move, he lunged forward and grabbed onto the bear. The second his hands made contact, the bear reacted. In a burst of instinct, it thrashed violently, sending a massive wave crashing over both of them. John's grip almost slipped, but he held on with everything he had. The water spun them in circles, dragging them further downstream. His lungs burned, his arms ached, but he refused to let go. "Hold on," he shouted, though he wasn't sure if it was to himself or the bear. The river was pulling them towards the rocks, sharp, jagged edges, waiting to crush anything in their path. If they hit those, it was over. John forced his body to move, kicking against the current, trying to guide them away from danger. But the bear was too heavy. It was dead weight now, too weak to fight back. John's vision blurred as another wave crashed over them. He was running out of strength. He couldn't hold on much longer. But then a break. A sudden shift in the current, pushing them towards the shallow edge of the river. It was now or never. Summoning every last ounce of energy, John kicked hard, pulling the bear with him. The seconds felt like hours, but finally, his feet touched solid ground. With one final desperate push, he dragged the bear onto the shore. His body collapsed beside it, his chest heaving, his heart pounding like a drum. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a gasp. A deep, shuddering breath from the bear. It was alive. They had made it. John let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. He had done it. He had saved it. But as he lay there, soaked and exhausted, one thought echoed in his mind: was the danger truly over? John lay on the muddy riverbank, his body trembling from exhaustion. The bear beside him was still, its massive chest rising and falling in heavy, uneven breaths. They were alive, but barely. The wind howled through the trees, and the roar of the river echoed in his ears. He had done the impossible, dragging a drowning bear out of a raging river. But as his mind cleared, one terrifying thought struck him. The bear wasn't safe yet. It was still too close to the water, still too weak to stand. If it slipped back in, it wouldn't survive another fight. And then there was another problem. What if it regained its strength too soon? A wild animal, confused and scared, could turn aggressive. A single swipe from its massive paw could crush bones. John's body screamed in protest as he pushed himself up. His legs were shaky, his arms burned, but he had no choice. He had to act fast. He turned towards the rangers, who were still standing frozen in shock. "Rope! Get me a rope now!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. One of them snapped out of his trance and sprinted toward their truck. John's eyes darted back to the bear. It was still breathing, but barely. Its fur was soaked, clinging to its body, making it look smaller than it actually was. But John knew the truth. This was a massive creature, one that wouldn't be easy to move. Within seconds, the ranger returned, tossing John a thick rope. His fingers fumbled as he looped it around the bear's torso, just behind its front legs. It was risky. If the bear woke up, it might panic. But John had no choice. "Pull!" he yelled, gripping the rope tightly as he planted his feet into the wet ground. The rangers joined in, their boots digging into the mud as they strained against the weight. The bear barely moved. Again, John growled, pulling with everything he had. His muscles screamed, his breath came in ragged gasps, but finally the bear slid an inch. Then another, and another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull it further from the river's edge. John collapsed to his knees, panting. His hands were raw from gripping the rope. It wasn't over, but they had bought themselves time. Then, a sound. A deep, low groan. John's heart stopped. The bear's massive head shifted slightly. It was waking up. The rangers tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons. John raised a shaky hand. "No sudden movements," he warned. The bear's eyes fluttered open, dark, confused, filled with something between fear and exhaustion. It let out another groggy groan, shifting slightly but too weak to stand. It was disoriented but alive. John exhaled slowly. They had done it. But just as relief washed over him, a new sound sent a chill down his spine. A deep, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. Another bear. John's blood turned to ice as he turned his head toward the forest. A second bear stood at the tree line, watching. It was massive, even bigger than the one he had just saved. Its dark eyes were locked onto them, its posture tense. Was it a mate? A sibling? A mother? Whatever it was, it had just seen humans dragging another bear out of the water, and now it was approaching. The rangers took a step back. "John, we need to move. Now." But John didn't move. He couldn't. If they ran, would the new bear attack? If they stayed, were they in even more danger? His heartbeat thundered in his ears. One wrong move could be fatal. The bear on the ground let out a weak rumbling noise, something between a groan and a whimper. The standing bear's ears perked up. It hesitated. John swallowed hard, his breath shallow. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands, not as a threat, but as a sign of peace. The standing bear huffed, taking a cautious step closer. John held his ground, his muscles coiled, ready to move if he had to. This was the real moment of truth. Would this bear see him as a threat, or as the man who had just saved one of its own? John's chest rose and fell in deep, exhausted breaths as he watched the massive bear stir on the riverbank. His arms ached, his legs barely held him up, but none of it mattered. The bear was alive. He had done what seemed impossible, pulled a drowning beast from the raging waters and given it a second chance. But the danger wasn't over yet. The second bear, the one standing at the tree line, took another cautious step forward. Its dark eyes flickered between John and the rescued bear, its massive frame tense with uncertainty. Was it a threat? Would it charge? John didn't move, didn't even blink. Any sudden action could turn this fragile moment into something deadly. Then, to his shock, the standing bear lowered its head and let out a deep, rumbling noise, not a growl, but something softer, more curious. It took another step, then slowly approached the weakened bear lying on the ground. John's breath hitched. Was it here to help? The injured bear groaned weakly, barely shifting as the other bear nudged it gently with its snout. The scene unfolding before John felt surreal. This wasn't an attack, this was recognition. The standing bear sniffed the rescued one, then huffed as if reassuring it. They knew each other. Relief crashed over John like a wave. The bear wasn't alone. It had a companion, maybe a sibling or a mate, who had been watching the entire time. John wasn't its only hope anymore. He took a slow step back, then another, giving them space. His job was done. The rescued bear had a chance now, not just to survive, but to return to where it belonged. For a moment, the injured bear turned its massive head and locked eyes with John. He felt something indescribable in that gaze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was understanding. The bear held his stare for just a second longer, before exhaling deeply and looking away. John swallowed hard. He would never forget that look. It was as if the bear knew. It understood that this strange human had saved its life. The second bear gave one last glance at John, before nudging its companion again, urging it to move. With visible effort, the rescued bear pushed itself up, its legs trembling beneath its weight. John could see it was weak, but it was standing. That was enough. Against all odds, it had survived. The two bears stood together for a few long moments, the injured one leaning slightly against the other for support. Then, with a final glance toward the humans, they turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the depths of the forest. John let out a long breath, his entire body sagging with relief. It was over. The tension that had gripped his chest finally eased, replaced by something else, something warm, something powerful. One of the rangers let out a low whistle beside him. "I don't believe what I just saw," he muttered. John let out a small, tired chuckle. "Neither do I." He turned to look at the river, still rushing violently, still as deadly as ever. Just minutes ago, it had almost swallowed that bear whole. But today, for once, the story had ended differently. As John wiped the water from his face, he knew this was a moment he would never forget. He hadn't just rescued an animal today, he had experienced something rare, something that most people would never understand. A connection, a silent moment of trust between man and nature. And as he walked away, exhausted but at peace, he wondered if the bear would remember this day too. Maybe, just maybe, it would. John's act of bravery was more than just a daring rescue. It was a reminder of the deep connection between humans and nature. Courage isn't just about facing danger. It's about having the heart to help, even when the risks are high. He didn't see a massive, powerful bear. He saw a life in need, and he chose to act. This story teaches us that even the wildest creatures sometimes need a helping hand. In a world where nature often struggles against human impact, small acts of kindness can make a huge difference. Every life matters, whether human or animal, and sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step forward. Wildlife conservation isn't just about protecting animals from harm. It's about respecting their place in the world. John didn't just save a bear, he preserved a piece of nature, proving that compassion and courage go hand in hand. As the bears disappeared into the forest, John was left with a powerful realization. True bravery isn't about strength alone. It's about kindness, empathy, and the willingness to do what's right, no matter the odds. If this incredible rescue story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with your friends, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Would you have risked your life like John did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. For more amazing real-life stories of bravery and compassion, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring moment. Every act of kindness counts, and together, we can spread awareness about the importance of wildlife protection.